The farmer noticed a strange pipe buried beneath his land that led straight under his barn. What he discovered at the end terrified him and changed his life forever. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city or country you're watching this video from. The storm had ended without ceremony, as if winter itself had grown tired and simply withdrawn, leaving the land buried under the weight of what it had thrown down. The night before, the wind had howled across the farm like something alive, packing snow against walls and fences, grinding ice into every seam and corner. By morning, the world lay muted and colorless, the sky a dull metallic gray that pressed low over the fields. Sound carried poorly in such weather. Even the crows were silent. The farmer stepped outside not out of curiosity but necessity. Storms were never abstract events on a working farm. They bent roofs, split boards, buried gates, starved animals if paths were blocked too long. He pulled his coat tighter as he crossed the packed snow near the house, his boots crunching on a surface hardened by wind and cold. His breath rose in slow clouds, lingering longer than usual in the still air. The temperature had dropped sharply after the storm passed, locking everything in place. He moved first toward the barns, scanning instinctively for damage. The smaller shed leaned a little more than it had the day before, and its foundation uneven where frost had shifted the ground. One of the fence rails along the eastern paddock lay half buried, snapped clean through. These were expected losses. Winter always collected its share. He took note of what would need fixing once the thaw came, then continued on, following the narrow path he kept clear with his own footsteps between the house and the main barn. It was there, just beyond the usual churn of tracks and trampled snow, that he noticed something wrong. At first, it registered only as an absence, a break in the pattern his eyes had learned to read over years of working the same land. The snow across the field should have been uniform, shaped only by wind and drift, but instead there was a line cutting through it, stretching away toward the far fence. It was too straight, too deliberate. It did not meander or fan out like a meltwater channel. It did not curve with the terrain. It ran as if drawn by a steady hand, a pale scar across the white. He stopped walking. The cold seeped up through the soles of his boots as he stood still, studying it. The line was not bare earth, not yet, but the snow there was different, thinner, pressed down. Its surface carried a faint sheen, as though it had softened and refrozen. On either side of it, the snow remained deep and powdery, untouched since the storm. He turned slowly, aligning his body with the direction of the line. It led away from the barns, cutting straight across the lower field, pointing toward the distant tree line where the land dipped slightly before rising again. His first thought was machinery. Some piece of equipment dragged unknowingly across the field before the storm, but there were no tracks, no ruts, no compression marks beyond the narrow width of the line itself. He walked closer. Up close, the precision of it unsettled him. The edges were clean, almost sharp. The width did not vary. He crouched and brushed away the top layer of snow with a gloved hand. Beneath it, the ice crust was thinner, fragile enough to crack under light pressure. He pressed his palm flat against the surface and waited. The difference was subtle, but unmistakable. The snow beneath his hand did not bite the way the surrounding ground did. It held a faint residual warmth, not heat, but something closer to life than death. He moved his hand a foot to the side, pressing into untouched snow. The cold there was immediate, sharp, unforgiving. He straightened slowly. Sunlight could not explain this. The sky was wrong for it, and the line ran through shaded ground as cleanly as it did through open field. Water did not explain it either. There was no slope sufficient to carry flow in such a narrow path, and no sign of pooling or spread. The ground here was frozen solid. Nothing moved through it easily in winter. He followed the line a few steps, then more, his boots crunching softly as he stayed just beside it, careful not to disturb whatever pattern might be there. The line held its course, unwavering. It did not fade as it approached the barns. It grew more pronounced. Near the barn wall, the snow had thinned almost to nothing. The ground beneath showed through in patches of darkened earth, damp rather than frozen. The boards along the lower edge of the barn were free of ice, their surfaces dry where they should have been rimed with frost. He knelt again, placing his hand against the wood. It was cold, but not as cold as it should have been. He felt a flicker of unease then, something deeper than curiosity. Farms accumulated oddities over time. Pipes were laid, lines were buried, repairs were made and forgotten. But this was not a remnant he recognized. He had walked this ground in every season for years. He knew where the frost lingered longest, where snow drifted deepest, where meltwater always cut channels in spring. This was new, or at least newly revealed. He followed the line right up to the barn wall, tracing it to a point where it seemed to vanish beneath the structure itself. The snow there was almost entirely gone, reduced to a damp, granular residue that steamed faintly in the cold air. He leaned closer, listening without knowing why. At first, there was nothing. Then, faintly, so faintly he could not be sure it was real, he sensed movement. Not a sound exactly, but a pressure change, a whisper that brushed the edge of hearing and retreated when he tried to focus on it. He shifted his weight, pressed his ear closer to the wall, then stepped back again. The barn had always been the most stable building on the property. Thick beams, heavy timbers. Its floor stayed dry even during heavy rains, its interior warmer than expected in winter. He had always attributed that to good construction and luck. Standing there now, he wondered if that explanation had been too simple. He walked the perimeter of the barn slowly, inspecting the ground along the foundation. In most places, snow lay piled high, crusted and untouched. Only along this one section did it retreat, as though something beneath the surface refused to let the cold fully claim it. The line did not end here. It disappeared under the barn, and, he suspected, continued on. He stood up and scanned the field again, following the line back with his eyes towards the distant trees. It struck him, then, how unnatural it was, not just in shape, but in intent. Natural forces were messy. They wandered. They exploited weakness and followed chance. This line did none of that. It was purposeful. A thought surfaced that he did not immediately welcome. If something lay buried beneath his land, something active enough to alter the snow in the dead of winter, then it had either been placed there by someone else or by someone long gone. Either possibility carried weight. He tested the ground again. With a metal rod he kept leaning against the barn wall, using it to probe the soil through the softened snow. The rod sank farther than it should have before meeting resistance. He withdrew it and felt the tip. It was cold, but not numbing, not the kind of cold that burned. He did not dig yet. He told himself there was no reason to rush. Whatever lay beneath the surface had been there through the storm and the freeze. It would not vanish if he waited a few hours, but as he stood there, staring at that precise, impossible line, he felt a subtle shift inside himself. A sense that the ground he worked, the land he believed he understood, held a layer he had never touched. He marked the edges of the line with a few broken sticks pushed into the snow, simple markers he could check later to see if anything changed. He traced its direction one last time, committing it to memory, then turned back toward the house. The cold pressed in again as he moved away from the barn, sharper now that he was no longer standing near whatever warmth bled up from below. As he walked, his mind worked through possibilities, discarding each as quickly as it formed. Old drainage made no sense. No water line would be active in this cold. Heating lines were absurd. There was no source. And yet the evidence remained, silent and undeniable. He reached the house and paused on the threshold, looking back across the field. The line lay there unchanged, a quiet interruption in the blankness of winter. It did not threaten. It did not announce itself. It simply existed. He went inside, but the sense of it followed him. The feeling that something beneath his feet was awake when everything else slept. And with that feeling came a decision, not yet fully formed, but inevitable. He would not leave this unanswered. Whatever lay under the snow had already made itself known. The earth, it seemed, had drawn a breath. The line did not leave his thoughts overnight. Sleep came in shallow intervals, broken by the memory of that precise mark in the snow and the quiet warmth that should not have been there. By morning, the sky had cleared into a brittle blue, the kind that followed deep cold, and the temperature had dropped even further. The farm lay locked in stillness, every surface hardened, every sound sharpened by the air. He did not speak of what he had seen. Habit told him that unexplained things, once spoken aloud, took on a different weight. Instead, he dressed with intention, choosing thicker gloves, heavier boots, tools that could break frozen ground without shattering what lay beneath. He ate quickly, barely tasting the food, his attention already outside, following the invisible path beneath the snow. He returned to the barn and stood where the line vanished under the wall. The markers he had placed the day before remained undisturbed, their shadows thin and straight in the pale sunlight. Nothing had shifted overnight. The warmth was still there, subtle but present, resisting the cold in a way that no exposed earth should have been able to do. He chose a spot a few feet from the foundation, where digging would not undermine the structure itself. The first strike of the shovel rang out sharply, metal biting into crusted snow and ice. He worked slowly, clearing away layers rather than hacking down through them, careful to read the ground as it revealed itself. Beneath the snow lay frozen soil, dense and stubborn, the kind that resisted intrusion. He chipped at it, breaking it apart inch by inch, setting the chunks aside. The deeper he went, the more the resistance changed. The soil grew less brittle, the sound of the shovel duller, as if the earth itself were softer here. Then the blade struck something solid with a hollow ring that was unmistakably not stone. He stopped immediately. Kneeling, he brushed away loose dirt with gloved hands until a curve of metal emerged, dark against the brown earth. It was cylindrical, smooth beneath the grime, its surface cold but not bitingly so. He cleared more of it, exposing a length of pipe running straight and true, aligned perfectly with the line he had followed across the field. He sat back on his heels and stared at it. Pipes belonged to systems. Systems implied purpose. Someone had put this here, and not carelessly. The pipe was laid with care, bedded evenly, not simply dropped into a trench and forgotten. He tested it the only way he could. He tapped it with his knuckles, then listened, his ear close to the earth. The sound that returned was hollow, open, and faintly resonant. There was no slosh, no echo of liquid movement. Whatever ran through this pipe, it was not water. He searched along the exposed section until he found a joint, a place where two lengths met. The seal was old but intact, wrapped in a material that had hardened with age. He pressed his hand near it, then closer, until he felt it clearly. Air moved there. Slow, steady, unmistakable. It brushed against his skin with a muted warmth that sent a ripple of disbelief through him. He withdrew his hand and flexed his fingers, grounding himself in the cold. The air coming through that pipe was not hot. It was not even warm by ordinary standards, but compared to the killing cold above, it felt alive. It did not steal heat from his skin. It did not numb. It passed over him like breath. He found a scrap of twine in his pocket and held it near the joint. The fibers lifted and leaned in one direction, drawn gently toward the barn. The air was moving with intent, flowing inward, not escaping. The implication settled slowly and heavily. This was a supply line. He followed the pipe visually as far as he could see, then cleared more ground in short intervals, tracing its path. It ran straight toward the barn wall and disappeared beneath the foundation stones. He circled the building, looking for any sign of where it might emerge inside. He knew the barn well. Every loose board and warped plank, every place moisture gathered or animals sought shelter. Inside, the air felt as it always had, cold but less severe than outside. He stood still for a moment, letting his senses adjust. Then he began to notice details he had long accepted without question. One corner of the floor where frost never seemed to form, a patch of boards that stayed dry even during heavy thaw. A faint current near the base of the far wall that stirred dust when the doors were closed. He knelt and pressed his palm against the floor there. It was cold, but again, not as cold as it should have been. He pried up one board carefully, working the nail loose without splitting the wood. Beneath it lay compacted earth, darker than the surrounding soil, and beneath that, the curved edge of metal. The pipe ran directly under the barn floor, feeding into the structure itself. He replaced the board and stood, his thoughts tightening. This was no abandoned remnant. The airflow he had felt outside did not dissipate here. It was being drawn through the barn, integrated into it in some way. Whether by design or accident, the building had become part of the system. He returned outside and followed the pipe in the opposite direction away from the barn. Digging was harder there, the ground less forgiving, but the line in the snow guided him unerringly. Every few yards he cleared a small window, confirming the pipe's presence, its depth, its condition. It ran well below the frost line, deeper than any shallow trench would have gone. Whoever had laid it understood the ground, understood winter. He found small stones packed carefully around it, creating a stable bed that would prevent shifting as the soil expanded and contracted. In one place, he uncovered a crude but effective drainage channel that allowed moisture to escape downward rather than pool around the pipe. These were not the choices of someone improvising. They were deliberate, informed decisions. As he worked, unease gave way to something sharper. Respect, perhaps, for the mind that had planned this, but also concern. Systems like this were built for reasons, and reasons had consequences. He paused often, listening, checking the air. It remained consistent, a steady draw toward the barn. No fluctuations, no signs of blockage. The system was functioning as it had been intended to function, despite its age. At one point, he uncovered a small vertical shaft branching off from the main pipe, capped with a metal grate just below the surface. Snow had melted above it, leaving a shallow depression. He cleared it and found the grate intact, fitted tightly to prevent intrusion. It was an intake, positioned to draw air from the open field, far from the structures, far from smoke or animals. This discovery settled something in him. The pipe was not carrying heat from a furnace or engine. It was carrying air, fresh air, air that traveled underground long enough to lose its bite, moderated by the stable temperature of the earth itself. He straightened slowly, the scope of it beginning to take shape in his mind. Air drawn from outside, tempered by the ground, delivered into the barn, and perhaps beyond. It was elegant in its simplicity, and it raised a question that pressed harder with every passing minute. Where did the air go after it passed through the barn? He followed the pipe farther, away from the building and toward the open land behind the house. The snow thinned again as he approached the old orchard, the line growing clearer, more pronounced. The trees there stood in uneven rows, their branches twisted and bare, their trunks dark against the white. It had been years since the orchard had produced anything worth harvesting. The soil was tired, the roots shallow. As he stepped into the space between the trees, he felt the ground shift subtly beneath his weight. Not enough to break through, but enough to register. A hollow give, like earth stretched thin over something else. He stopped moving. The pipe led here. Not just to the orchard, but into it, deeper than the eye could see. Whatever lay at the end of that line was not incidental. It was the destination. A memory surfaced then, unbidden, a name spoken once or twice in the past, always with a shrug. A woman who had lived nearby years ago, who worked the land differently, who had been said to experiment with soil and seeds in ways that did not make sense to most people. She had left or disappeared, depending on who told the story. The orchard had begun to fail not long after. He pushed the thought aside. Speculation would not help him now. He covered the exposed sections of pipe carefully, packing the soil back into place, smoothing the snow as best he could. He did not want signs of disturbance visible from a distance. This discovery felt like something that should remain quiet, at least for now. As he finished, he stood once more at the edge of the orchard, looking down at the snow-softened ground. The air moved beneath it, unseen and steady, doing its work without sound or sign beyond the subtle betrayal of melting snow. The land, he realized, was not just breathing, it was guiding him, and he knew, with a certainty that left no room for retreat, that he would follow. The orchard had always been a place the farm endured rather than used. The trees were old enough that no one remembered who had planted them, their trunks scarred and bowed by decades of wind and frost. In summer, they cast thin, uneven shadows, and in autumn they produced more leaves than fruit. In winter, they stood bare and skeletal, their branches etched black against the snow. The farmer had long since stopped expecting anything from them. They were simply there, occupying a strip of land behind the house that resisted improvement no matter how much work he put into it. Now, standing at the edge of that same orchard, he felt the ground beneath it reassert itself in his thoughts. The pipe did not end at the barn. That much was clear. Its direction was unwavering, as precise beneath the soil as the line it had drawn across the snow. It ran straight into the orchard, into a place most people would have dismissed as spent ground. He stepped carefully between the first row of trees, his boots sinking slightly where the snow lay thinner than elsewhere. Here, too, the surface told a different story. The snow was compacted, its crust uneven, as though it had softened and settled repeatedly over time. In places, a faint dampness darkened the surface, quickly crusting over again in the cold. The orchard smelled different as well, a subtle shift he would not have noticed if he were not already alert. Beneath the clean sharpness of winter air lingered the faint, unmistakable scent of earth that had not fully frozen. He moved slowly, testing each step. Several times he paused, pressing his weight down deliberately, feeling for that same slight give he had noticed earlier. It was there, intermittent but real, like the surface of a lake before it froze solid. Not dangerous yet, but not as firm as it should have been in midwinter. He began to mark the pipe's path again, clearing small patches of snow every few yards to confirm its presence. Each time, the result was the same. The metal lay deep, insulated by packed earth and stone, running true and level, but here in the orchard, something else accompanied it. The soil above was looser, less compacted, as though it had been disturbed at some point in the past and never fully regained its original density. The farmer's mind turned reluctantly at first toward memory. He had not owned the land forever. The deed had passed through other hands before his, and the history of those years was vague at best. Stories circulated, half remembered and rarely examined. A woman who had lived alone on the property for a time. Someone who worked the land differently. Someone who had not stayed. He had dismissed those stories before as the usual rural mythology that grew up around anyone who did not fit neatly into expectation. But now, following a hidden line beneath the ground, he could not ignore the possibility that the orchard was more than neglected soil. It might be a lid. He stopped near the center of the trees, where the snow dipped slightly into a shallow basin no wider than a few feet across. The depression was subtle enough to escape notice unless one was looking for it, but once seen it could not be unseen. The surface here was smoother, the snow thinner, and when he pressed down with his boot, the ground yielded just a fraction more than elsewhere. He crouched and brushed away the snow with his gloved hands. Beneath it lay compacted sod, darker and denser than the surrounding soil. He probed it with his metal rod. The resistance was firm, then abruptly different, as though the rod had struck wood or packed clay rather than raw earth. His breath fogged the air as he leaned closer. The faint movement of air he had sensed near the barn was present here as well, but stronger. It rose gently from the ground, carrying with it that same moderated temperature, neither warm nor cold, simply stable. He cleared more snow, widening the area carefully. As the surface emerged, the outline of something deliberate began to take shape. The sod was cut in straight edges, fitted together like pieces of a puzzle. This was no natural formation. Someone had laid this here intentionally, disguising it as ground. The realization sent a shiver through him that had nothing to do with the cold. He did not uncover it all at once. Instinct told him to proceed cautiously, to understand before exposing. He traced the perimeter first, following the edges of the sod, noting how it blended seamlessly into the surrounding earth. Roots from the orchard trees had grown over it, knitting it into place over time. Leaves had fallen, decomposed, and become part of the disguise. The land itself had been recruited into hiding whatever lay beneath. As he worked, fragments of the past pressed closer. He remembered conversations overheard years ago at the feed store, vague remarks about experiments that went nowhere, about money wasted on soil tests and strange growing methods. There had been talk of government interest, too, though no one had ever said exactly what kind. The woman's name surfaced then, uninvited, sharp and clear in his mind. He had never met her, but he had seen her once, long ago, from a distance. She had been kneeling in the orchard, her hands buried in the dirt, surrounded by notebooks and jars. At the time, it had seemed harmless, even admirable. Now, it felt like the first page of a story no one had wanted to finish. He uncovered a narrow seam along one edge of the sod and slid the tip of his rod into it. With gentle pressure, the section lifted slightly, then settled back. It was heavy, reinforced from beneath. Not a hatch meant for frequent use, but a cover designed to endure. He sat back on his heels, the weight of the discovery settling in his chest. Beneath this orchard lay space. Not a shallow root cellar or drainage pit, but something larger, something connected to the system he had already traced from the field to the barn. The pipe was not simply feeding air into the structure above. It was part of a larger network, one that led here beneath his feet. The thought that he might be standing atop a hollow space filled him with a strange combination of awe and fear. The earth felt thinner now, less solid, as though his understanding of it had been stripped away. He was no longer just a farmer walking his land. He was an intruder approaching a boundary someone else had gone to great lengths to conceal. He tested the air again, lowering his face close to the seam. The flow was gentle but steady, rising from below and moving toward the barn. Whatever lay beneath required ventilation, required it constantly. That knowledge sharpened his caution. Enclosed spaces needed air when people or living things occupied them, or when processes occurred that could not be allowed to stagnate. Either possibility implied intention and maintenance. Even if no one had been here in years, the system had been designed to endure. He gathered himself, standing slowly, scanning the orchard and the surrounding land. The farm lay quiet. No movement beyond the distant tree line. No sound but the faint creak of branches in the cold. He was alone with the ground and whatever secret it held. He considered leaving it untouched, at least for now. Marking the spot and returning later with more preparation, but the pull was stronger than caution. He had followed the pipe this far. Turning back now would not restore ignorance. The knowledge was already lodged in him, demanding resolution. He prepared carefully. From the barn, he retrieved rope, a lantern, spare fuel, tools sturdy enough to pry without splintering what lay beneath. He checked the weather again, noting the clear sky and the promise of another bitter night. If he was going to look, it had to be now. Returning to the orchard, he cleared the remaining snow from the sod cover, exposing its full outline. It was larger than he had first thought, wide enough for a person to pass through. The edges were reinforced with timber, darkened by age but still solid. He worked the seam slowly, levering the cover upward inch by inch until it shifted with a muted groan. Cold air rushed in, displaced by the deeper, steadier air rising from below. The opening exhaled as though relieved. He held the lantern close and peered down. The light revealed a vertical shaft lined with stone and clay, its walls smooth and deliberate. The pipe ran alongside it, disappearing downward, continuing its quiet work. The shaft descended farther than he could see, its bottom lost in shadow. He tied the rope to a nearby tree, testing the knot twice, then anchored the other end securely. The lantern's flame flickered as he lowered it slightly, watching how the air moved around it. The flame steadied quickly, a good sign. Oxygen was plentiful. Standing there, with one hand on the rope and the other on the edge of the opening, he felt the final resistance within him give way. Whatever had been hidden here was not meant to be found easily, but it had left a trail, and he had followed it. The land itself had guided him, one subtle sign at a time, from snow to pipe to orchard. He took a final look at the surface world, at the bare trees and frozen ground, then began his descent into the space the past had tried to bury. The descent changed everything almost immediately. The shaft swallowed the sound of the wind as soon as his boots left the surface, replacing it with a quiet so complete it felt deliberate. The rope slid steadily through his gloved hands as he lowered himself down, the lantern casting a soft amber glow that revealed smooth stone walls curving inward slightly, guiding both body and air toward the space below. The temperature shifted within the first few feet. The biting edge of winter dulled, replaced by a cool stability that felt neither warm nor cold, but deeply steady, like the interior of the earth itself. As he went lower, the air grew denser, carrying a faint scent that stopped him for a moment. It was not mold or decay, not the sour dampness of a neglected cellar. It was soil. Living soil. The smell was unmistakable to anyone who had spent years working land by hand. It was the scent of turned earth, of roots and minerals and moisture held in balance. It had no place underground in winter, and yet it surrounded him. His boots touched solid ground far below the surface. He released the rope slowly, testing his footing before committing his weight. The floor beneath him was compacted and dry, layered with fine gravel that absorbed sound. He raised the lantern, and the space around him emerged from the shadows, not abruptly, but gradually, as though revealing itself on its own terms. The chamber extended far beyond what he had expected. This was not a cramped tunnel or survival shelter hastily dug into the ground. It was wide and tall enough for a person to stand comfortably, its ceiling arched and reinforced with stone and packed clay. The walls bore the marks of a careful construction, stones fitted tightly together, seams sealed with a mixture that had aged into something harder than mortar. Everything about the place spoke of intention and patience. He took a few steps forward, his movements slow and deliberate, aware of how easily careless motion could disturb something fragile or irreplaceable. The lantern light traveled across the walls and caught on reflective surfaces embedded at angles, thin sheets of polished metal or mineral that redirected the glow deeper into the chamber. Light, he realized, had been planned here, guided and preserved. Then he saw the plants. They emerged from the darkness gradually, at first as shapes, then as color. Not the pale, desperate growth of something starved for sun, but rich greens and muted reds, thick stems and broad leaves arranged in orderly rows. The soil beneath them was dark and loose, alive with structure. Some plants bore small buds, others heavy leaves that glistened faintly with moisture. In the depths of winter, beneath frozen ground, life was thriving. He stopped completely, the lantern steady in his hand, and let the reality of it settle. This was not an experiment abandoned halfway. This was not the aftermath of a single growing season. The plants varied in size and stage, indicating cycles, planning, continuity. Someone had tended this place over time, refining it, learning its rhythms. As he moved closer, he noticed the organization. Beds were laid out with precise spacing, narrow paths between them compacted by repeated use. Wooden markers stood at the head of each row, their surfaces darkened with age, but their inscriptions still visible. Dates, symbols, names written in a careful hand. The markings were not decorative. They were records. The air moved constantly, gently, never still. He followed its flow with his senses, noticing how it entered from vents along one wall, traveled across the beds, then exited through channels near the ceiling. The pipe he had traced from the field fed into a larger system here, branching and distributing airflow evenly. This was ventilation, not merely circulation. It controlled humidity, temperature, freshness. It kept the space alive. He raised the lantern higher and saw the ceiling more clearly. Thick beams of timber reinforced the stone, their surfaces smooth from age rather than neglect. Between them, layers of earth and sod provided mass, holding warmth gathered from the ground. This was thermal design, not accident. The earth above did not merely hide the space, it sustained it. At the far end of the chamber, he saw shelves built into the wall, lined with jars, cloth-wrapped bundles, wooden boxes fitted together with care. He approached slowly, lifting the lantern to read the faded labels. Seeds, dried plant matter, samples preserved with meticulous attention. Each container was marked, cross-referenced with the symbols he had seen on the beds. This was not storage for survival alone. It was an archive. He moved deeper into the greenhouse, his awareness expanding with every step. Tools hung from pegs along one wall, cleaned and arranged by size and function. Some were clearly handmade, modified to suit specific tasks. Others bore the marks of factory manufacture, though aged and repaired. None were broken or abandoned. They had been put away properly, as if their owner intended to return. Near the center of the chamber stood a work table, its surface scarred with use. Not random scratches, but the kind left by years of careful work. Notebooks lay stacked at one end, their covers warped slightly but intact. He reached out, hesitated, then touched one gently. It was dry, protected. He opened it slowly. The pages were filled with dense handwriting, precise and consistent. Columns of data, observations, sketches of root systems and airflow patterns. Notes on soil composition, moisture levels, plant response to seasonal shifts. The writing was confident, not tentative. Whoever had filled these pages knew exactly what they were doing. He closed the notebook and exhaled, only then realizing how shallow his breathing had been. The scale of what he was seeing pressed in on him from all sides. This was not merely a hidden garden. It was a complete system, a closed loop of energy and life built beneath the ground, insulated from the violence of surface weather. It was sustainable in a way he had never imagined possible. He walked along the beds, careful not to disturb the soil. Some plants were familiar, hardy varieties adapted to cold climates. Others were unlike anything he recognized, their leaves thicker, their structure more compact, as though shaped by generations of selective pressure. These were not accidents. They were results. The deeper he went, the more he sensed the presence of the person who had built this place. Not as a ghost or a lingering spirit, but as intention embedded in every choice. The spacing of the beds, the direction of airflow, the way light was captured and redirected, even the placement of the entrance, hidden beneath an orchard that would draw no attention. This was the work of someone who understood both land and people, someone who knew what needed to be concealed. At the far end of the greenhouse, the space narrowed slightly into a secondary chamber. Here, the walls were lined with thicker stone, the floor raised by a low platform. He recognized the purpose instinctively: thermal mass, a place where heat collected and lingered, radiating slowly back into the space. The temperature here was noticeably warmer, the air still moving but slower, gentler. He stood there for a long moment, lantern lowered, absorbing the implications. The pipe, the orchard, the barn, the airflow, all of it converged here. This underground greenhouse was not an isolated project. It was the heart of the system. A quiet unease crept in alongside his awe. Such a place could not exist without effort. It required planning, resources, time, and above all, secrecy. Someone had chosen to build this beneath the surface rather than claim land openly. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure it would not be discovered by accident. He returned to the work table and opened another notebook. This one was different. Less data, more narrative. personal entries woven between technical observations, references to seasons passing above, to storms endured without consequence below, mentions of isolation, of caution, of watching the surface world from beneath it. He closed the book again without reading too far. Some things felt too intimate to consume all at once. He needed context before meaning. Standing in the center of the greenhouse, surrounded by living proof of ingenuity and persistence, he felt the first true shift inside himself. The discovery was no longer abstract. It was not just a question of what lay beneath his land. It was a question of inheritance, of responsibility. This place existed now in relation to him. Whether he wanted it or not, he had stepped into its orbit. He lifted the lantern and turned slowly, committing the space to memory. Every vent, every bed, every marker. He needed to understand it fully, not just as a marvel, but as a system that might yet demand something from him. As he moved back toward the shaft, the steady movement of air followed him, guiding him without sound. The earth breathed evenly, indifferent to his presence yet altered by his awareness. When he reached the base of the rope and looked up at the narrow circle of light above, he understood that whatever lay ahead would not remain buried forever. The greenhouse was alive. And now, so was its secret. He returned to the greenhouse the next morning with a different state of mind. The first descent had been driven by discovery and disbelief, by the need to confirm that what he had seen was real. Now he came with intention. He brought additional lantern oil, a second light source, paper and pencil, and a careful resolve to observe rather than react. The underground space no longer felt like a secret he had stumbled into by chance. It felt like a place that demanded to be understood on its own terms. The transition from the frozen surface to the stable underground air was just as striking as before, but less shocking now that he anticipated it. His body adjusted quickly, his breath slowing, his senses sharpening. The greenhouse greeted him with the same quiet order, the same steady circulation of air, the same improbable presence of life beneath winter-bound soil. Nothing had changed overnight, and yet everything felt different because he had changed. He moved first towards the shelves along the wall where the jars and boxes were arranged with such care. Yesterday, they had registered only as proof of scale and seriousness. Today, he examined them one by one. Each container bore a label, written in a small, precise hand. Some labels were faded, their ink softened by time, but all were legible. Names appeared again and again, sometimes, repeated across multiple containers with different dates appended. Other labels carried place names, elevations, soil types, weather notes. This was not hoarding. It was curation. He lifted one wooden box and set it gently on the work table. Inside, dozens of small cloth packets were stacked neatly, each tied with thread and marked with a symbol that corresponded to the ledger he had seen in the notebooks. He untied one carefully and poured a small portion into his palm. The seeds were unfamiliar, slightly larger than most grains he knew, their surfaces matte rather than glossy. They felt dense, alive with stored potential. As he replaced the packet, he noticed a repetition of certain names. Not plant names, but people's names. Each appeared alongside dates and brief notes. Successful yield, poor adaptation, resistant to frost, improved structure. It dawned on him slowly that these were not casual acknowledgments. They were credits. Each name marked a contribution, a lineage of experimentation that extended beyond a single mind. He turned to the notebooks again, this time selecting one at random rather than the first that caught his eye. The handwriting inside was consistent with what he had seen before. but the tone differed. These pages were less technical, more reflective. The writer documented not only results, but reasoning. Why one approach had been abandoned, why another had been pursued despite setbacks. There was no doubt left in his mind now. The woman who had built this place was not hiding from the world because her work had failed. She had hidden it because it had succeeded. Page after page revealed a methodical pursuit of resilience. She wrote about soil as a living system, not a medium to be exploited but a partner to be understood. She described airflow not simply as ventilation, but as a regulating force that shaped plant behavior. She recorded the Earth's stable temperature at different depths, comparing it to surface extremes, using it as a baseline rather than an obstacle. Her words carried the confidence of someone who had tested her ideas repeatedly and seen them validated. He read until the lantern light began to strain his eyes, then closed the notebook carefully. His hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but from the weight of what he was holding. This was not just a hidden greenhouse. It was a body of knowledge, one that had been developed deliberately, patiently, and in isolation. He moved along the beds again, this time reading the markers more closely. Each row carried a history. Dates spanned years. Some markers were replaced or updated, old ones left in place beneath new notes. It was clear that this space had evolved over time. Plants had been introduced, tested, refined, or discarded. The soil itself bore signs of careful amendment. Layers of organic matter built up slowly rather than dumped all at once. At one bed near the center, he stopped. The marker there bore a single name, written more prominently than the others. The same name appeared repeatedly in the notebooks, often in entries that expressed both progress and caution. He recognized it then as the name he had heard in passing years ago, the one attached to rumors and unfinished conversations. Seeing it here, anchored to something living and productive, gave it a gravity those stories had never conveyed. He traced the letters with his eyes, not touching them, as though contact might disturb something. This bed, more than any other, was thriving. The plants were robust, their leaves broad and dark, their stems thick. Whatever strain had been cultivated here had been refined carefully, protected from exposure, allowed to develop without interference. The realization that followed was slow but relentless. If this work had been brought to the surface, it would have drawn attention. Attention from institutions, from companies, from people who saw land and life only in terms of ownership and extraction. The decision to build underground had not been an eccentric choice. It had been a defensive one. He returned to the shelves and found a different category of containers. These were sealed more tightly, wrapped in layers of cloth and waxed paper. The labels were minimal, sometimes only a symbol and a date. He opened one cautiously. Inside were seeds unlike the others, darker, heavier, fewer in number. Alongside them lay a folded sheet of paper, thin and brittle but intact. The note was brief. It described a strain that had taken years to stabilize, one that demonstrated resistance not only to cold, but to poor soil and limited light. It was marked with warnings, not about danger, but about exposure. The writer emphasized restraint, patience, gradual testing. She warned against sudden introduction, against drawing notice before the system could be protected. He folded the paper and replaced it carefully. The pattern was clear now. This was not just agricultural innovation, it was strategic. Every element of the greenhouse served a dual purpose: growth and concealment, productivity and protection. He sat at the work table and allowed himself a moment to think beyond observation. What did this mean for him? The farm above was struggling. Winters were harsher than they had been a generation ago. Soil quality declined despite effort. Markets were unpredictable, unforgiving. Here, beneath his feet, lay a solution that could change everything. Not just for him, but for anyone facing the same challenges. And yet, the notebooks told another story as well. They spoke of pressure, of inquiries framed as opportunities, of requests that quickly turned into demands. The writer described meetings that left her uneasy, correspondence that hinted at appropriation rather than collaboration. There were no explicit accusations, no names recorded in full, but the implication was unmistakable. She had chosen secrecy because openness had become unsafe. He closed the last notebook and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The weight of responsibility pressed in on him from all sides. He had not sought this. He had not earned it. And yet, here it was, anchored to his land, now tied to his choices. He gathered one small box of seeds, selecting it deliberately. Not the most advanced strain, not the one marked with the strongest warnings, something intermediate, something that could be tested quietly without immediate consequence. He slipped it into his coat, feeling its presence like a question against his chest. Before leaving, he walked the length of the greenhouse one last time, committing the arrangement to memory. He extinguished one lantern to conserve fuel, leaving the space dimmer but still alive with reflected light. The air continued to move, steady and patient, as though it had all the time in the world. As he ascended the shaft and replaced the sod cover carefully, blending it back into the orchard floor, he felt the boundary between surface and underground shift within him. The farm above no longer felt complete on its own. It was now the visible half of something much larger, something that had been growing quietly for years without his knowledge. Standing among the bare apple trees, he looked across the snow-covered land with new eyes. The ground beneath it was no longer inert. It held memory. It held intent. And it held seeds, waiting not just for the right season, but for the right choice. The days that followed were marked by a careful duality. On the surface, life on the farm continued as it always had. Animals were fed, equipment checked, small repairs made where winter had bitten hardest. The farmer moved through these routines with practiced ease, aware that familiarity was its own kind of camouflage. Beneath that outward normalcy, however, his thoughts were tethered to the space below the orchard, to the notebooks and seeds now hidden again beneath layers of sod and snow. Each ordinary task felt faintly unreal, as though it were being performed atop a second, unseen world that breathed steadily beneath his feet. At night, when the house was quiet and the wind pressed against the walls, he returned to the notebooks in his mind. He had not taken them to the surface. That felt wrong, too exposed. Instead, he relied on memory, replaying passages, reconstructing patterns. The woman's writing was methodical, but it carried a subtle arc that became clearer the more he thought about it. There was a point, midway through her records, where the tone shifted. The language grew guarded, observations were still precise, but commentary narrowed, as though she had begun to measure not just soil and airflow, but risk. In the earlier entries, she wrote freely of her work. She described consultations with agricultural offices, meetings with visiting researchers, small grants that had allowed her to purchase materials and equipment. She spoke of optimism, of the belief that innovation could be shared and improved through collaboration. The underground greenhouse had begun not as a hiding place, but as an experiment in efficiency, a way to stabilize growing conditions in a climate that punished inconsistency. Later entries told a different story. Interest in her work intensified, but not in the way she had expected. Questions became insistent rather than curious. Requests for data were framed as formal obligations. She noted visits that arrived unannounced, inspections that focused less on methodology and more on ownership. There were references to contracts presented prematurely, to language that implied control rather than partnership. The underground system, once a technical solution, began to take on a new purpose. She wrote of realizing that what she had created could not exist comfortably in the open. The strains she was developing did not require vast acreage or heavy inputs. They thrived in constrained spaces, in poor soil, under moderated conditions. They represented independence, a kind of resilience that could not be easily monopolized unless it was claimed early. That realization seemed to mark the beginning of her withdrawal. The farmer remembered now how abruptly she had vanished from local awareness. One season she had been present, visible at supply stores and county offices, and then she was simply gone. There had been no sale announcement, no farewell. The orchard had been left untended, the house abandoned. People had filled the silence with assumptions. She had moved on. She had failed. She had lost interest. None of those explanations held weight anymore. As he pieced together her account, another detail unsettled him. The later entries included references to maintenance performed under cover of darkness, to adjustments made to airflow routes and intake points. She described rerouting the system so that its primary exhaust blended with existing farm structures, reducing the chance of detection. The pipe leading to the barn had not been incidental. It had been camouflage. This knowledge altered the way he saw his own farm. Features he had always taken for granted now carried new implications. The barn's stable temperature, the absence of mold despite poor ventilation by conventional standards, the way snow melted unevenly in winter. All of it had been shaped by a system designed to hide something valuable. What troubled him most were the final entries. They were sparse, written at irregular intervals. She mentioned being followed, not overtly, but with the language of someone who understood surveillance well enough to recognize its subtler forms. Vehicles that passed too often, inquiries made through intermediaries. Pressure applied indirectly, through offers that became warnings when declined. She never described a confrontation. There was no dramatic account of threats or ultimatums. Instead, there was a quiet tightening of options. She wrote of accelerating her work, of securing seed banks and duplicating records. She described building redundancy into the system, ensuring that even if parts were compromised, the core could survive. The final notebook ended without resolution. The last entry was brief, almost clinical. She noted that the greenhouse was stable, that airflow and temperature had held steady through the season. She expressed cautious hope that the system would persist without direct oversight. There was no farewell. No explanation of departure, just an observation, and then silence. The farmer closed his eyes when he reached that point in memory, feeling the weight of what had been left unsaid. Disappearances did not need to be violent to be final. Sometimes removal was accomplished simply by isolating someone until they had nowhere left to stand. The underground greenhouse, for all its ingenuity, could not protect a person indefinitely. As the days passed, subtle changes began to register on the surface. A truck slowed near the road one afternoon, its occupants watching the farm longer than necessary before moving on. A stranger stopped at the gate, asking questions that were framed as casual curiosity, but carried an edge of assessment. None of these encounters were overtly threatening. That was what made them unsettling. They mirrored the patterns described in the notebooks too closely to be coincidence. He altered his routines in response, not dramatically, but enough to reclaim a sense of control. He varied the times he worked the orchard. He approached the barn from different paths. He paid closer attention to tracks in the snow, to tire marks on the road. At night, he listened more carefully to the sounds beyond the house, distinguishing wind from movement. Returning to the greenhouse became a calculated act rather than an impulse. Each descent was planned, each visit purposeful. He began to notice details he had missed before. Small repairs that had been made recently, perhaps years after the system was built. A replaced hinge, a patched seam in the ventilation channel. Someone had maintained this place beyond its creator, or at least attempted to. That realization deepened his unease. If others knew of the greenhouse, then the disappearance was not simply a matter of abandonment. It was part of an unresolved narrative, one that might still be unfolding. The possibility that someone else had an interest in the system and might return to claim it could no longer be dismissed. One evening, after a light snowfall, he noticed footprints near the orchard that were not his. They were partially filled in by drifting snow, old enough to have softened, but new enough to stand out against the otherwise untouched surface. They did not approach the exact location of the hidden entrance, but they came close. Close enough to suggest awareness without confirmation. He stood there for a long time, studying the impressions, imagining the person who had made them. Someone cautious, someone who circled rather than approached directly, someone who knew enough to look, but not enough to act openly. The farmer felt the boundary between observer and participant dissolve completely in that moment. Whatever had happened to the woman who built the greenhouse was no longer confined to the past. Her choices had shaped a situation that now included him, whether he had invited it or not. He returned to the house and sat in the dim light, turning over the implications. The seeds he had taken were still hidden, untouched. He had not planted them yet. That restraint felt increasingly significant. Once he did, he would be leaving traces of his own, adding himself to the system's history in a way that could not be undone. The disappearance was not a single event, he realized. It was a process. One that began with interest, progressed through pressure, and ended in erasure. The underground greenhouse had been built to resist that process, to preserve something valuable beyond the reach of those who sought to claim it. But preservation came at a cost. As he prepared for sleep, the air in the house felt different, heavier with awareness. The farm was no longer just a place of work. It was a threshold. Beneath it lay answers that carried danger alongside promise. And somewhere, in the absence left behind by the woman's disappearance, there lingered a warning he could not afford to ignore. The earth continued to breathe, steady and indifferent, holding its secrets. The question was no longer whether the farmer would become part of them. It was how long he could remain unseen. The knowledge changed the shape of his days. It did not announce itself loudly or demand immediate action, but it pressed steadily against every decision, every hesitation. The disappearance described in the notebooks was no longer an abstract warning from the past. It had become a living framework through which he interpreted the present. The slowed truck on the road, the careful questions at the gate, the footprints near the orchard were no longer isolated moments. They formed a pattern, one that mirrored too closely what the woman had recorded in her final months above ground. He understood now that secrecy was not a switch that could be flipped on or off. It was a discipline, one that required consistency, restraint, and an acceptance of limits. The greenhouse below the orchard had survived because its creator had learned that lesson early enough to act on it. Whether she had survived was another matter entirely. The seeds he had taken remained untouched, hidden in a dry space where temperature and moisture could not reach them. Each time he considered planting them, he imagined the chain of consequences that might follow. Healthier crops, higher yields, questions from neighbors, attention from buyers, interest that would not remain benign for long. Growth, he realized, was never invisible. It announced itself through change, and change drew scrutiny. At the same time, the pressures that had driven him underground in thought did not relent. The farm was barely holding. Winters were longer, springs less predictable. Soil that once responded to careful rotation now seemed exhausted despite his efforts. He watched neighbors struggle openly, their fields producing less each year, their margins narrowing to nothing. He could see in their faces the same calculation he made every night. How long could this continue? The temptation to act grew sharper with each passing day. The greenhouse offered not just survival, but abundance of a specific kind. Not industrial surplus, but stability. Food grown without dependence on external inputs. Crops that did not fail when the weather turned. Knowledge that could break a cycle of scarcity that seemed increasingly permanent. He tested the idea quietly, starting with observation rather than action. He returned to the greenhouse to study the intermediate strains, those marked as adaptable but not exceptional. He reviewed the notes describing gradual introduction, small-scale trials, the importance of blending new growth into existing systems rather than replacing them outright. The woman had been meticulous about this. She understood that sudden transformation attracted attention in ways gradual improvement did not. He selected a narrow strip of land at the edge of his fields, an area already known for inconsistent performance. There, he prepared the soil as he always had, making no unusual amendments, no visible changes that would stand out. The seeds he chose were few, planted sparingly, mixed among varieties already familiar to him. If they thrived, they would do so quietly. Even as he planted them, he felt the weight of the decision settle deeper. This was no longer observation. It was participation. He had crossed from custodian of a secret into bearer of it. Whatever grew here would bind him more tightly to the hidden system beneath the orchard. Days passed, then weeks. Nothing remarkable happened at first. The field looked as it always had, dormant and unpromising under late winter skies. He worked as usual, tending animals, repairing fences, moving through the rhythms that grounded him. But beneath that routine ran a current of vigilance. He watched for signs of interest that might correlate with his own quiet experiment. The interest did not abate. If anything, it sharpened. A representative from an agricultural supplier stopped by unannounced, offering new seed lines and asking pointed questions about soil performance. A buyer mentioned hearing that his land had unusual characteristics. The questions were always indirect, framed as opportunity rather than inquiry, but their persistence carried meaning. He began to understand the true cost of truth. It was not simply danger or loss, it was the erosion of autonomy. Once knowledge like this entered the open, it would no longer belong to the person who revealed it. It would be analyzed, appropriated, scaled beyond recognition. The careful balance the woman had achieved underground would be dismantled in the name of efficiency. One evening, after returning from the orchard later than planned, he found a note tucked into the gatepost. It was unsigned, brief, and written in neutral language, an offer to discuss the future of the land, an expression of interest in what lay beneath the surface, phrased ambiguously enough to deny intent if challenged. The message was clear without being explicit. Someone knew, or suspected enough to probe. He burned the note that night, watching the paper curl and blacken in the stove. The act brought no relief. It only confirmed what he had already sensed. The window for remaining unnoticed was narrowing. He returned to the greenhouse with a different purpose then, not to study, but to inventory. He examined the hidden caches more thoroughly, locating compartments he had previously overlooked. Behind a false panel in the stone wall, he found a sealed container holding duplicates of the notebooks written in a different hand, a copy meant for survival, not use. Alongside it lay folded schematics detailing airflow routes, intake points, redundancies built into the system. At the bottom of the container, wrapped in oilcloth, he found documents of a different nature. Correspondence, contracts unsigned, letters requesting transfer of research under terms that stripped the creator of control. Marginal notes in her hand marked phrases that troubled her, language that suggested inevitability rather than negotiation. There were also names, partial at first, then clearer. Organizations rather than individuals, enough to establish pattern, not enough to accuse without risk. The woman had not trusted any single safeguard. She had scattered proof, layered it, made it difficult to erase entirely. Holding those papers, he understood that the greenhouse was not just an agricultural achievement. It was a defensive structure built in anticipation of conflict. Its creator had not simply vanished. She had retreated as far as she could, then left the rest to time and chance. The farmer faced the same choice now, sharpened by proximity. He could continue quietly, using the system just enough to survive, hoping attention would drift elsewhere. Or he could confront the truth directly, forcing it into the open in a way that could not be quietly resolved. Both paths carried risk. One risked slow exposure and eventual loss. The other risked immediate consequences that might extend beyond him. He considered who might stand with him if he chose to act openly. The answer was uncertain at best. Neighbors were stretched thin, wary of any disruption. Institutions responded to leverage, not morality. Truth alone had little weight unless it was made unavoidable. He prepared contingencies regardless of his final decision. He duplicated the records again, storing them in separate locations, some above ground, some below. He divided the seed stock, hiding portions where discovery would not lead to total loss. He memorized key elements of the system, understanding that knowledge could not be confiscated if it lived only in his mind. At night, he walked the orchard, listening to the soft movement of air beneath the soil. The system continued to function, indifferent to the tension building above it. It did not know fear or ambition. It existed to sustain, not to choose. Standing there in the dark, he recognized the final truth the woman's notes had implied but never stated outright. There was no safe outcome. There was only a choice between different kinds of loss. To remain silent was to accept erasure by inches. To speak was to risk destruction in a single stroke. The price of truth, he realized, was not paid all at once. It accumulated, compounding with every decision deferred. Whatever he chose next would define not just the fate of the greenhouse, but the shape of his own life from this point forward. By the time he returned to the house, the decision was no longer theoretical. It was approaching, steady as winter, unavoidable as the breath of the earth beneath his feet. The night the decision finally took shape was colder than the others. the kind of cold that pressed against the house with quiet insistence, testing every seam and joint. The sky was clear, stars sharp and distant, and the snow reflected their light faintly, turning the land into a pale, watchful expanse. The farm lay still, yet the farmer felt anything but. The sense that something was moving beneath the surface, not just in the ground but in the structure of his life, had become impossible to ignore. He stepped outside long after darkness had settled fully, pulling his coat tight as he crossed the yard toward the orchard. Each step felt deliberate, as though the ground itself were counting them. The apple trees stood in rigid lines, their branches etched against the sky like black veins. Snow crunched softly underfoot, the sound magnified by the silence. He stopped at the edge of the hidden entrance and stood there for a long moment, listening. The air beneath the soil moved steadily, just as it always had. It did not rush or hesitate. It did not care that attention above had sharpened, or that choices weighed heavier now than ever before. It moved because it was designed to move, because balance required it. In that constancy, he found an unexpected clarity. He knelt and brushed snow from the ground, not to open the entrance, but to feel the earth itself. The surface was cold, unyielding, but beneath it lay warmth that did not announce itself. The greenhouse did not challenge winter. It ignored it. It existed on its own terms, sustained by patience rather than force. That was when he understood what the woman who built it had known all along. Survival did not require confrontation, it required endurance. The world above changed with noise and pressure, but the world below persisted quietly, adapting without drawing attention. The true strength of the system was not what it could produce, but how invisibly it could do so. He stood again and scanned the orchard, then the wider farm beyond it. The fields were bare now, their future uncertain. He thought of the neighbors struggling openly, of the questions that had already begun to circle, of the documents hidden underground that could upend lives if brought into the light. He thought, too, of the seeds in his possession, and the first tentative shoots that would soon emerge in the test plot he had planted. He could still choose to expose everything. The evidence was there. The proof of pressure, of attempted control, of a disappearance that had never been properly accounted for. If he pushed it into the open, he might force reckoning. He might also destroy the very thing he sought to protect. Institutions did not nurture what they could not own. They dismantled it, repackaged it, stripped it of context until only utility remained. The breathing earth beneath his feet offered another path, one that did not seek validation or permission, one that accepted limits and worked within them. The woman had not built the greenhouse to change the world overnight. She had built it to ensure that something true could survive long enough to matter. By the time he turned back toward the house, the decision had settled into him with a calm he had not felt in months. He would not reveal the system. Not now, perhaps not ever. Instead, he would become what the greenhouse required, a caretaker rather than a herald, a steward of knowledge that moved quietly from one season to the next, embedded in practice rather than proclamation. The days that followed reflected that choice. He tended the experimental plot with care, never more than necessary, never in ways that would draw attention. When the first signs of growth appeared, subtle but unmistakable, he allowed himself only a moment of acknowledgement before covering the evidence with normality. The new plants did not announce themselves with dramatic vigor, they simply endured. They resisted frost better than expected. They held moisture longer. They did what they had been designed to do. Questions continued to surface, but he met them with the same steady restraint the woman's notes had modeled. He spoke of weather patterns, of incremental improvements, of luck and timing. Nothing he said was false. It was simply incomplete. Over time, the interest dulled. Attention drifted elsewhere, toward louder changes and easier targets. He continued to visit the greenhouse, though less frequently now, always at irregular intervals. Each visit reaffirmed the system's stability. The airflow remained balanced. The beds thrived. The notebooks rested where they had been left, their contents unchanged but no less vital. He added to them sparingly, recording his own observations in a different hand, careful to preserve the original structure. He did not erase the woman's presence. He extended it. One evening, while adjusting a vent near the ceiling, he noticed the subtle gradient of warmth across the stone walls, the way heat collected and released itself gradually. It struck him then that the greenhouse was not just a place of growth, but a memory made physical. Each layer of earth, each carefully placed stone, held the imprint of decisions made long before he had known to look. By choosing to preserve it rather than expose it, he had aligned himself with that memory. Above ground, life settled into a new rhythm. The farm did not transform overnight, but it stabilized. Losses slowed. Yields became more predictable. He shared selectively, quietly, offering surplus to those he trusted without explanation. In this way, the greenhouse's influence spread without a name, without a center that could be targeted or claimed. The footprints near the orchard ceased to appear. The slowed trucks stopped slowing. Interest dissolved into the background noise of rural life, replaced by other concerns, other rumors. Whatever attention had brushed the edges of the secret moved on, finding no purchase. Years later, standing once again among the apple trees, he reflected on how close everything had come to unraveling. The orchard still looked neglected to anyone passing by. The barn remained unremarkable. The land bore no obvious sign of what lay beneath it. That invisibility was its greatest strength. He placed his hand on the ground and felt the faint warmth rising, steady and patient. The earth continued to breathe, as it always had, indifferent to human urgency. Beneath the snow, beneath the roots, beneath the weight of history, life persisted not because it was announced, but because it was protected. The secret remained, not as a burden, but as a responsibility. One carried quietly, season after season, by someone who had learned that the most enduring truths were not the ones shouted into the world, but the ones kept alive beneath it. If this story kept you watching until the end, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. More hidden truths, forgotten places, and stories like this are already waiting for you. Watch the next video, explore others on the channel, and share this story with someone who loves real mysteries buried beneath the surface.